Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Tech Forum session. I'm Aline Zara, Research Coordinator at BookNet. Welcome to Applying AI to Publishing, a balanced and ethical approach. Before we get started, BookNet Canada acknowledges that its operations are remote, and our colleagues contribute their work from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wyandot, the Mi'kmaq, the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation, the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, and the Métis, the original nations and peoples of the lands we now call Beaton, Brampton, Guelph, Halifax, Thunder Bay, Toronto, Vaughan, and Windsor. We encourage you to visit the native-land.ca website to learn more about the peoples whose land you are joining from today. Moreover, BookNet endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space-making in the book industry. The book industry has long been an industry of gatekeeping. Anyone who works at any stage of the book supply chain carries a responsibility to serve readers by publishing, promoting, and supplying works that represent the wide extent of human experiences and identities in all that complicated intersectionality. We at BookNet are committed to working with our partners in the industry as we move towards a framework that supports space making, which ensures that marginalized creators and professionals all have the opportunity to contribute, work, and lead. For our webinar today, if you're having difficulties with Zoom or have any tech-related questions, please put your questions in the chat, or you can email techforum@booknetcanada.ca. We're providing live ASL and closed captioning for this presentation. To see the captions, please find the Show Subtitle button in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. If during the presentation you have questions for us, please use the Q&A panel found in the bottom menu. Lastly, we'd like to remind you of the Code of Conduct. Please do be kind, be inclusive, be respectful of others, including of their privacy. Be aware of your words and actions, and please report any violations to techforum@booknetcanada.ca. Do not harass speakers, hosts, or attendees, or record these sessions. We have a zero tolerance policy. You can find the entire Code of Conduct at bnctechforum.ca/code-of-conduct. Now, let me introduce our speaker. George Walkley is an independent strategy consultant, an expert in artificial intelligence in publishing. Working with the Independent Publishers Guild, he has delivered training on AI to delegates from more than 200 publishers worldwide, across trade, children's, professional, and academic segments. Prior to establishing his consulting practice in 2020, George spent 15 years at Hachette UK, where he held senior roles in digital strategy and marketing. He is also an experienced non-executive director and startup advisor, and a doctoral candidate at Bristol Business School. Over to you, George.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us. I hope that my audio and video are coming through clearly. If at any point the unexpected happens and you can't see or hear me, please reach out to your hosts. And hosts, if something goes wrong, please let me know. There is a backup connection here if we need it. It's very good to be talking to all of you about AI. This is a very visible topic. It's all around us. I just saw a reminder of this just 1 minute ago in the chat. There's a message saying that someone has brought their AI assistant to the meeting, and there is now an AI in this meeting that is generating a transcript, taking screenshots. I'm just reading from this, and adding highlights and comments. It's quite interesting, isn't it? That's something that a few years ago would have seemed almost unthinkable, almost like something out of science fiction. But it's now an everyday part of business and publishing life for all of us. Now, in this presentation, I'm just trying to switch between, here we are. So in this presentation, I'm going to start by introducing myself, give an overview of the talk, and then I'm going to go through really 4 key areas. I'm going to aim to speak for about 35 or at most 40 minutes, and then allow time for any questions that all of you have. Our hosts have already given some of this data, so I'm not going to go through all of this page, but I've been around the book business for a little while, and I have seen several waves of digital transformation. First, the emergence of the internet as a retail channel when I was a bookseller competing with this new thing called Amazon. Subsequently, I was in a trade book publisher at the time that ebooks and audiobooks became a big thing. And now I'm seeing AI come through. As was said, I was approached last year to develop some training on AI for the Independent Publishers Guild, which is the largest grouping of publishers in the UK. It has over 650 members, and that really covers a very broad range, from a one-person operation, which is effectively a self-published author at one end of the scale, to very major public companies like Bloomsbury and Sage at the other end. Within it, we have almost every kind of publisher: independent trade publishers, university presses, specialists, Thames and Hudson in the art world, for example, or children's publishers. I've also worked with some of the big 5 trade houses on AI. And so I hope what the last year has given me is a good aggregate perspective on how AI is being used in publishing and how AI might be used. So the 4 things that I said I was going to talk about this afternoon. First of all, I want to acknowledge up front 6 key issues which I think we need to talk about when formulating a balanced and ethical approach to AI. Those are the pace of change, the copyright regime and how this affects copyright holders, authors, but also translators, illustrators, photographers, and so many other creative professionals. I want to talk about accuracy and provenance. I really want to talk about environmental impact, which is an aspect of AI which I think we're all becoming much more aware of and which is critical for all of us. I'd like to talk about the way that AI is being integrated into the applications that we use. And I want to talk about how this affects resourcing and tasks within publishing organizations. Second of all, I'd like to talk to you about some example use cases, things that I see happening time and time again across the organizations that I'm working with, and things that work well in different contexts, different publishing contexts, excuse me. Thirdly, I really want to get to this question of what is a balanced and ethical approach. Now, ethics are a very individual thing. It is important to acknowledge there is a range of opinion on this issue. I know one well-intentioned, principled publisher that will not use AI in any way because of their ethical concerns about it. I know another publisher that is in a similar space, but is adopting AI wherever they can use it in their organization. And if we think of a spectrum between those two positions, most of us will find ourselves somewhere along that spectrum. And perhaps if you're like me, at different places on it from day to day as things emerge. So we'll talk about what the principles might be. And though I can't promise to give you answers, I can give you questions that you might ask yourself. Finally, we'll come to questions that you have for me. And I hope that within the webinar format, we can have a really good and engaged discussion. So let me start by talking about the issues. And the first thing that I want to talk about is the pace of change. And I want to talk about a concept that computer scientists call a capability overhang. AI systems are developing really rapidly. For a long time, ChatGPT was the market leader. There are now more than 10 peer applications with similar levels of performance, which are competing with it. Those models are not only proliferating in terms of the number of models, but also their performance. The Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI runs an annual index with 9 benchmarks that they look at. And on 6 of those 9 benchmarks, AI exceeded the performance of the average human being in this year's index, which is pretty remarkable. It is important to say that there are some areas that AI struggles with. For some reason, complex math, and interestingly, sort of ethical, moral, philosophical judgments are all areas where AI struggles a little bit. But in many areas, it's very, very good. But it is also little understood. I have been around technology for my entire career in publishing, and there's a pattern that I expect to see. If I go to a technology company's website and read their documentation, I expect to read something that is authoritative. I expect that the engineers there know more about that technology than I do. It's very instructive if you go to the OpenAI website and read the developer documentation. The tone of it is very striking. Engineers there are routinely surprised by what their own system is capable of doing. Reflect on that point for just a moment. The people building the system do not fully understand its capabilities. And sometimes that's wonderful because AI can do something that we hadn't expected it to. But at other times, we see AI doing things that were not designed intentionally. I hope that few people would design an AI that was capable of hate speech as a matter of intention. But we see AI reflecting the human language that it is trained on and capable of bias, capable of hatred, capable of behaviors that we would not want to see. And so this capability overhang is what happens when we have a technology that we do not fully understand. Ethan Mollick at the University of Pennsylvania, who, for my money, is one of the better researchers in this area, estimated last week that if all AI development stopped, it would take 5 to 10 years for researchers really to catch up with what we have today. And spoiler, the pace is not going to stop overnight. We are in a period of time as a result where I think we are all going to learn more from experimentation than we do from documentation. And that's perhaps not an entirely comfortable place to be. It calls on all of us to achieve a balance between waiting for certainty about what we're doing versus the short-term benefits we can get from jumping right in. Everyone on this call will form their own opinion about where they sit between those 2 points, but it's a really important one to think about. The second issue, let's deal with this very early because it is supremely important: copyright. Now, copyright is the underpinning of what we all do as publishers. The exclusive economic right to benefit from a work that is offered through copyright encourages creative people to do new things, to create the works that I hope we are all proud of publishing. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind, in fact, I don't think there's any doubt at all, that copyrighted material has been used extensively to train AI models without explicit authorization from copyright holders. We know from the expose that was run last summer by The Atlantic magazine, looking at the use of the Books 3 corpus for training large language models. We know from litigation that's been taking place against all of the major AI companies, as recently as a few weeks ago, a new lawsuit was initiated against NVIDIA, pointing to its use of ebooks from file sharing websites as part of its training data. So there is no question that copyrighted material has been used. The real question is whether that is acceptable or not. Now, I should sound a note of caution here. I am not a lawyer, much less I'm not a Canadian lawyer. So there may be aspects to this in Canadian law that I'm unfamiliar with, and I ask for your patience if I go up against something that you understand better than me in the specific Canadian sense. But in broad terms, the key concept here is the idea of fair use. Copyright has always been a balance between the rights holder and society. We accept that after a period of time, the author's life plus a set number of years, the book enters the public domain, because actually Jane Austen has had enough time, and Jane Austen's descendants have had enough time to benefit from her work economically. And it therefore goes into the public domain and society benefits. Similarly, if an academic quotes from a particular book for the purpose of scholarship, we accept that there is a societal benefit to that scholarship, and they should be given an exception to copyright to do that. Now, as far as the AI companies are concerned, what they are doing is no different to that. They are creating models that benefit society broadly, and as a result of that broad benefit, rights holders should accept that their work has been used. Now, it is very important to acknowledge that many rights holders disagree profoundly with that position. Many trade organizations disagree profoundly with this position, hence the litigation. But the AI companies continue to use copyrighted material. Now, at the same time, they also continue to license material from large publishers. In recent weeks and months, we have seen major licensing deals being announced by rights holders such as Taylor and Francis, John Wiley, Condé Nast, Reddit, Springer-Verlag, and many others. Why would the AI companies be claiming that they have the right to use something automatically on the one hand, and at the same time paying tens of millions of dollars to large media companies for access to their data? Well, I think there's a combination of factors going on there. First of all, licensing gives those companies access very often to specialist data sets that they may not be able to get through common crawl and through looking at material that's available on the web. Secondly, being slightly cynical, I would observe that those licensing deals are largely with big media companies that have the resources to be able to sue the AI companies. Bluntly, I think they're reaching legal agreements with companies that are large enough to frighten them, or large enough at least to run litigation for a number of years plausibly. The final thing is I think that there's an element of long-term planning here. Quite where courts will come down on this question of fair use is uncertain today. It's very interesting to observe the appeal court's judgment on the Internet Archive versus Hachette and others last week, which was an affirmation of copyright holders' rights. If a court was to find against one or more of the AI companies and they had to withdraw books from their training data sets, it would be a non-trivial proportion of what they've looked at. And I think that what they're doing with licensing is achieving a minimum viable set of data that they know they have access to and that cannot be taken away from them. But the key point that I would like to leave you with is that, in my opinion, the legal position on this is unlikely to be fully clear for some time. The first 2/3 of my 15-year career at Hachette were taken up with the Authors Guild versus Google litigation that some people on this call may remember. In fact, it was toward the end of that litigation, in a discussion about it at the Publishers Association in London, that I first heard the terms large language model and training data mentioned. Given that that case took nearly 10 years to reach a settlement, I feel very pessimistic that the AI questions are going to be resolved significantly faster than that. And so again, as we all begin to think about a balanced and ethical framework for AI, it's quite clear that we will be operating with an uncertain legal position, but that there are short-term commercial pressures from leadership, from shareholders, from colleagues even, to use AI where it can make us more productive. And again, there is a spectrum of opinions here. Where do you sit on it? I cannot tell you where you should, but you should form your own view. The next question is one of accuracy and provenance. Large language models are far and away the area of AI that has exercised publishers most because they are closest to the written word, the thing that many of us care about most. It's very tempting, I think, sometimes to imagine that AI and LLMs have greater capabilities than they do. To be clear, they do not have intrinsic knowledge or understanding, let alone wisdom. These are platforms that work on a probabilistic basis. And they have a huge amount of information. Some 15 trillion tokens of training data went into Meta's Llama 3 model earlier this year. It's a remarkable amount of information, but it's not exhaustive. And as a result, AI is capable of making mistakes. It's capable of generalizing patterns, which it thinks should exist, but do not. It is capable of errors of fact, and it's capable of repeating them. And thinking about publishing as a global endeavor and thinking about the spread of knowledge as a global endeavor that really matters, the use of AI has some very troubling aspects. We know, for example, from research that the training data used in AI systems is overwhelmingly biased to the world's top 10 languages. If you are looking for a perspective in the English language or Spanish or Mandarin, it is very likely you are going to get a reasonable result. On the other hand, I recently did a piece of work in the Republic of Ireland, and one of the questions that I was asked was about the existence of an Irish Gaelic large language model. And interestingly, there is a very good large language model for that language. But just as a comparison, the extent of digital training data available to that model is about 750 megabytes. In other words, it would fit on an old-fashioned floppy disk. Now, clearly, a model with that amount of training data is not going to be as robust as a model that has perhaps 55 petabytes of data. So we need to be very aware that there are biases in these models. They don't give a uniform perspective. A publisher that I worked with last year specializes in publishing perspectives from the global south. And one of their findings was that when discussing that topic, when discussing a perspective from the global south, AI was much less capable and fluent at giving responses than when giving a perspective about the UK. The errors that AI makes really fall into two categories: large and obvious errors versus subtle and pernicious ones. Large and obvious errors are the ones that are mortifying in the moment when they happen to us. Things like an illustration with a human being with 6 or 7 fingers on their hand because an AI model can't draw hands well. Something like a really embarrassing date error in a book. I've seen both of those happen with publishers using AI. But the good news is they're relatively easy to spot, and as embarrassing as they are relatively easy to correct. Again, referring to Ethan Mollick's work, the much more dangerous sort of error is the very subtle and pernicious one. I recently saw one of my students who I supervise submitting a piece of work, and they had used AI. And AI had completely hallucinated a journal article that was cited in this student's work. Now, the alarming thing was that one of the authors that it had hallucinated was a real author in that field. The journal in question was a real journal. At first glance, it looked really plausible that that would be a journal article. It was even something that I would have expected that author to write on. But it had been completely made up. Now imagine someone else reading that work, citing that fictitious journal article. Imagine down the track someone doing a literature review in several years and seeing it and accepting it at face value. We can easily see how misinformation could spread. Now, not every publishing use case has an equal risk profile here. Some things, ideation, where there's a human being looking at the results, is a much lower risk thing to do. Process automation, again, where a human being is looking quite closely at the results, is much lower risk. But anything that is going to go into a printed book, anything that will have the authority of the printed book behind it, needs particular care. In very high stakes use cases, we may even want to look at ways of augmenting accuracy. We may look at, for example, a technique like RAG, retrieval augmented generation, where we provide more reference data to ensure that the output is good. And finally, on this question of accuracy and provenance, we really need to think about the identification of AI-generated content. Now, this is something that has really come to the fore this year in 2024 because it is a super election year around the world. If you're a political nerd like me, it's incredibly exciting to see all of these elections happening. And we see an alarming amount of deep fake content that's being spread. But if, like me, you use several popular social media channels, you may have seen on Snap or TikTok or Threads or Instagram, AI-generated audio and images and video are being labeled. Now, the detection of them is not perfect, but at least it's a starting point. The bad news for all of us is that we're particularly concerned with the written word. And as I have seen with my own students in a university setting, it is very hard to know with certainty whether the written word is generated by AI or by a human being. The best systems that most universities use can give a probability. They can give a direction that something is likely to be written by a human being or likely to be written by AI, but no better than that. In fact, some of the detection software is not only inaccurate, but also actively discriminatory. It has been shown, for example, that people speaking English as a second language are far more likely to be accused of using AI than native speakers, something to do with the underlying patterns of language. So it's very difficult. And now let's relate that to the publishing context. Let us think about the extraordinary creative endeavor that is a book, all of the people who go into it. Let's think particularly about the context we all work in, where we're no longer necessarily physically sitting next to our colleagues, but we may all be working remotely. How does that work with AI? Well, there's a very recent survey that was done by Pricewaterhouse, the management consultants, and they found that of the people in the workplace who had used AI, more than 2/3 of them had not been candid with their colleagues and their manager about their use of AI. They had taken the productivity benefit, in other words, and kept quiet about how they had achieved it. Now let's think about standards for disclosure. We know already that many parts of our supply chain are looking quite correctly at understanding what it is they have on sale. Amazon, Ingram, bookshop.org are all examples of retailers who are looking for transparency from publishers about what they are offering. I know of one case already where a very large publisher was queried and was accused of having used AI for a particular aspect of one of their books. And thankfully, they had a good audit trail and they were able to demonstrate that it was human created. But these are questions that are being asked. Do we know what our colleagues are doing? That's a human problem, not a technological problem. And it comes down to conversations that we have with the people around us. It comes down to the standards that we set as organizations. And it comes down to people understanding why these standards are being set. Where AI has been used as part of a book, are we disclosing that to the end consumer? I recently purchased an academic monograph, which had been translated from the German language. And there was nothing on the publisher's webpage or on any of the retail listings for that monograph that indicated that AI had been a part of it. Yet when the monograph arrived, there was a note on the back of it explaining that it had been translated using an algorithm called DeepL. Did that publisher owe me a duty of transparency in advance of the purchase? I would like to think so, as a matter of fact. Now, so far, we've been talking about issues that are quite intractable, where there is a range of opinions. But I want to come on to a couple of things that I think are much more accepted. I spoke to a small publisher, a literature publisher, earlier this year, who told me that they are not using AI in any way, shape, or form in their business. In fact, they are making a positive statement that they will not use it because they believe their business is about human creativity and because they believe that is part of their competitive advantage. That is a good and a principled position, and on a personal level, it's one that I admire. As a business person, though, I have to ask, practically, how easy is it to achieve that and not to use AI at all? If we think back to November of 2022 and the launch of ChatGPT, AI systems were extraordinary because we had to go to a particular website. We had to go to ChatGPT. We had to create an account and in order to use it. And then once we had that, it was slightly magical. It could do all of these things, not terribly well, but it could write bad poetry. It could write an itinerary for a business trip. It could summarize a long document. And it seemed pretty remarkable. Today, AI no longer requires a specific visit to a specific single-purpose website. It is being built into every aspect of the software stack that we use as publishers. Microsoft Office, Google Workspace, Adobe Creative Suite, GitHub, a shout out to any more technical people in the room, general productivity applications like Slack or Notion, bibliographic software like Firebrand or Biblio. In a larger publisher, you may have an ERP system for resource planning, and that almost certainly has AI too. And it's not just the individual applications that we use, but AI is being built in on an operating system level as well. If, like me, you're running a Windows machine, you've probably seen the Microsoft Copilot app appearing on your computer. If you have a modern version of iOS on an Apple phone, you will see Apple Intelligence rolling out. Their keynote yesterday evening talked a great deal about this. So AI has gone from being something that required a specific intention to use to being something that is now pretty difficult to avoid. If, like my very principled publishing friends in the UK, you wanted to avoid it completely, how would you do that? What software would you use? How would you govern what all of your creative freelancers, your service providers were doing? How would you govern what happened to your books downstream of you when information goes out through retailers or aggregators? AI may touch your book at almost any one of these points. And precisely because it is so hard to avoid, I think that's why the questions of ethics and working out your own policy become so important. The next point is environmental impact. I think we all recognize that we are in a capitalist society on a warming planet, and there are no easy answers to the questions that are being asked of all of us. We know that this webinar, every email we send, even every ebook that we publish, has an environmental impact. Perhaps modest compared to a physical book and the road miles and the physical raw materials that go into it, but still tangible nonetheless. And we know that AI is a particularly energy and water intensive application. Why water intensive? Simply because the data centers that use AI have enormous requirement for cooling, and water comes in there. Harvard Business Review did a piece of work which looked at the energy impact of AI and said that it was pretty similar to that of a mid-sized industrial economy. I think Belgium was the example that they used as a benchmark. But at the same time, we also know that some of these figures are quite contested. At the same time that AI is generating increased data center use, it's also helping those data centers run more efficiently. It's also helping technology move more forward. Informa, the information business in the UK, did a study that showed that in the 10 years to 2018, its computing workload had risen by 550%, but that actually resource consumption in its data centers had only gone up by 6% in that period. So it does not follow that resource consumption goes up in lockstep with the amount of workload. Now, again, I'm giving you two extremes. I'm giving you two ends of a spectrum. The reality is probably somewhere between those. And it is very hard for all of us as publishers to assess our own impact. I've looked within my own business at our use of AI, and I've looked very diligently at the companies we use, and it's very difficult for me to even estimate the individual impact that my usage has. I'm going to suggest that this is actually a broader problem. Scope 3 emissions, which are the carbon emissions related to our supply chains, but what happens up and downstream of us, are very difficult for us to assess. As a matter of fact, I've read many environmental statements from large publishers, and I would dearly love to know the methodology that they've used to work out, for example, the impact of their digital publishing. I really struggle to see how they've done that. And I think that AI is going to exacerbate that problem. By the way, if anyone has come up with solutions for estimating their own AI impact or even scope 3 digital impacts more generally, I would dearly love to hear them, because I think this is a compelling problem where we need to share best practice. And finally, I want to talk about perhaps the thing that's most relevant to all of us as individuals rather than members of society. What's the impact of AI on our jobs, on our roles? Now, when I first started really looking intensively at AI, I think that the public mood was somewhat different. There was an optimism around AI. There was a sense that this was something cool and science fictional, and it was going to do interesting things. Over the last year or so, that sentiment has shifted quite sharply. Most people in repeated studies are pessimistic about the impact of AI. The Pew Research Center in the United States is particularly strong on this. And they have shown that less than 1/3 of American consumers believe that AI will bring them personally any economic benefit, as opposed to the large technology companies. There is very particular concern from creative people, from writers, but also from the freelancers that make up such an important part of our ecosystem. Editors, translators, illustrators, cartographers. Next week, in fact, I am talking at a conference of indexers, and there's deep concern there about the impact of AI. Recently, Price Waterhouse put out a piece of work suggesting that 43% of the work of traditional writers could be replaced by AI systems. So you can see why people are worried. At the same time, the very largest corporations, the same people who have driven more than $1 trillion of capital investment in AI over the last 5 years, are also wondering if that investment was a good one. Goldman Sachs, who have been enthusiastic cheerleaders for AI, recently had a research report headlined, "Too much spend, too little benefit." So where are we? What's going to happen with this? Now, interestingly, my perspective looking at all of the organizations I've worked with is that AI is not proving genuinely disruptive. I'm not seeing AI in any, excuse me for a moment, I'm not seeing AI take people's jobs in any widespread or consistent way. Sure, there are individual people who are generating books with AI and flooding self-publishing platforms with them. There are some authors and publishers that have become far more effective with it. But I have not seen a single role that has been completely supplanted by AI. More often, what is happening is that AI is leading to incremental gains in productivity, particularly around ideation, coming up with new things, and particularly around the automation of tasks. The experience that I had with the university press in the UK was very typical. After using AI in a very structured way for 6 months and measuring the impact very carefully, they found that they had saved a measurable number of person days per month, and that was very valuable to them. That was time that could be invested back in more valuable creative activities. For example, the salesperson who previously spent an entire afternoon a month standardizing sales reporting, who automated that process with AI, and now has that afternoon spending time on the phone or on Zoom with customers and learning more about their business. That's a great example of a positive sort of swap of low value work for high value work. And I think AI empowers that. Now, it's not quite transformative enough to fulfill the promise that the big companies were looking for. But in the context of a publisher, it's more than enough. Now, I don't know if anyone remembers this, but there was a period of time about 10 to 12 years ago where the UK cycling team was almost unstoppable. We had had a staggeringly good Olympic Games. Everything was very good. And there was a theory at the time called the aggregation of marginal gains. This was the idea that actually to make a really significant improvement in one area, to take your business a 20% leap forward, is actually very difficult to do. But if you can make 200 small improvements, each representing 0.1%, and you aggregate those together, you get something that is really meaningful. And that was what British cycling attributed its success to in large part. And I wonder whether that's quite an interesting metaphor for where we are now. I'm not seeing AI take away the work of authors or even creative freelancers or publishers, but it's making all of those people slightly more effective. And my question to you is whether in aggregate, across the collective endeavor that is a publisher, that leads to a real benefit. Now I'm going slightly over, so I'm going to speed up, but I really want to allow time for questions. Where do I see AI being used today? Across all of the businesses that I've worked with, across all of the types of publisher that I've worked with, these are the top 10 things that I see AI being used for. Ideation and coming up with initial ideas. Most of us are quite fearful. I know I'm fearful of a blank screen or a blank sheet of paper. It's much easier to edit than it is to create. And so asking AI for first ideas on a topic is quite powerful. Similarly, generating summaries, typically going from long documents to short ones, very powerful. Metadata creation, taking an entire book and identifying keywords, identifying themes, identifying concepts that can be put into metadata, very powerful. Repurposing content. I was at a publisher recently where the same underlying information about the book was being presented to, respectively, booksellers, librarians, school teachers, parents, and the children who would eventually read the book. It was being repurposed multiple times, and AI is very good at that kind of quick repurposing, always with a human being checking it. Content creation is another really interesting one. The book itself, I don't see any widespread use of AI to actually write the actual book. There are just too many gaps to fill in for a probabilistic model, to do that well. But on the other hand, what I see AI being used for is things like chapter comprehension quizzes, lesson plans for teachers, reading group guides for literature, so you have some suggested topics to talk about with your friends, ancillary videos to support the book. All of those are being produced through AI in large number. I spoke to an educational publisher here in the UK that I was working with, and they encapsulated this shift for me by saying that prior to AI, their ambition was to have a lesson plan for every book that they published. And now, using AI systematically, their ambition is to have a lesson plan for every chapter of every book that they publish. Content translation is really interesting. Actually, having shown a friend who speaks very good German, the AI translated monograph that I bought was pretty good. There are real limits, I think, to this. I think shorter monographs, I think sales material and marketing material can be translated quite well. I would be very nervous about trusting an algorithm with 80,000 words of book. But on the other hand, I see translators who are using AI to do a first pass that they then quality check. And that to me feels like a very good model for doing this. The creation of audio and video is happening a great deal. I think this is really powerful, particularly for audiobooks as an accessible format. We have a 0 to 1 problem with audiobooks. It would be preferable if every audiobook was voiced by a human actor. But the reality is there are so many titles in the backlist that won't happen. But AI has the potential to open that up and to make more accessible resources. The antepenultimate point, AI is really helpful for helping to automate tasks. I've seen VBA macros in Excel, Python scripts for data analysis, even JavaScript extensions for Creative Suite, all being written by people giving plain language instructions and then getting code that they can test and use. Within design teams, Adobe Firefly is pretty much business as usual for the generation, not of complete covers, but certainly of stock imagery that can be used as part of those covers alongside a human designer. And finally, I'm seeing custom GPTs being used more and more in publishers. The publisher that built a custom GPT for their entire backlist to help identify backlist titles that had relevance to news stories as a publicity angle. The publisher that built a custom GPT to help with font licensing, or the publisher that put all of their sales data into a custom GPT and now have it answer questions that are phrased in plain English rather than having to filter a complex spreadsheet. The impact of all of these use cases is immediate and in many cases measurable. And I will say that it is particularly impactful within smaller publishers. Big publishers typically have large teams, large structures, and there's a lot of institutional inertia, which they have to wade through. But very often I've seen small teams of 4 or 5 people have the productivity of a team of 6 or 7 people by using AI alongside their work sensibly. So let's close by talking about some principles of balanced and ethical use. You will think about your own businesses and where you sit on these questions, but I think these are good things to start with. AI is hard to avoid, and there is an immediate return on investment from getting it right, which means that you may be put under pressure to use it. It is really important that the human being is in the loop, always. AI is a little bit like having an infinite number of interns working for you. That intern might produce a staggeringly good piece of work that surprises you, or they might miss the mark completely, generally because the instruction they've been given is not good enough. I doubt very much that any of us would put something out of the door that an intern had produced without checking it carefully. And that's exactly the correct mental model to have with AI. Thirdly, look at issues and impacts across your entire value chain. Think about all of the people who interact with your books, the freelancers, the service providers, the retailers, the information aggregators, and think about how they all use AI. One of the businesses that I work with discovered that a service provider overseas was putting all of the books sent to them into the public version of a particular large language model. And there was no contractual basis for them to be doing it. So I really recommend the practice of mapping out your own information value chain, identifying all the participants, and working through with them what expectations you have. Identify higher risk use cases. If you are going to originate content that you charge money for, if you're going to assert copyright on AI generated content, or if you're working with a subject matter that is particularly sensitive, for example, there's something about the perspective of the participant, diversity as a factor, all of those would be flags to me to think very carefully about the use of AI and increase the level of human scrutiny that goes into those use cases. On the other hand, play to AI's strengths: ideation, drafting, repurposing, automation under human review. And those are lower risk use cases you can get real value from. Involve all stakeholder groups in this. Some of the most impressive publishers that I've seen in this area have really gone out very broadly and have spoken to their authors, to agents, to creative freelancers, to their customers, and they've involved all of those groups in the formulation of their policy. Every time I've seen that done, it has brought valuable perspectives. And conversely, every time I've seen publishers make significant reputational missteps around AI, it's very often been the case that they have not communicated well with one or more stakeholder groups. Thirdly, seventh point, use AI resources mindfully. There is an impact to using them. It is not a zero-cost exercise. We all have to make individual judgments about our use of resources, whether physical or digital. And your own organization may have policies there. But I feel quite happy that my use of AI is for professional purposes, and I'm not using it to generate cat pictures and memes, as entertaining as they might be. You'll reach your own ethical determination there, but please think about it. Finally, start with smaller, measurable projects. And I can see, by the way, hello to the person who's put this in the chat. There's a question about this specific point. One of the publishers that I worked with started out by saying, well, we want to use AI to look at our entire editorial workflow. Okay, great. Good luck. That's a wonderful ambition to have. But that is a multi-month project where an awful lot can go wrong, and you are currently standing on first base. It is quite unlikely that you are going to achieve that without a lot of complexity and some mistakes along the way. Instead, start with something very small and measurable. So a tangible example here. A publisher that I worked with did a survey of its staff, and one of the things that apparently nearly everyone hated was the cover briefing process. And so they had an experiment where instead of starting with a cover brief that was laboriously written by an editor, they had the editor and the designer sit together, agree on some comparison and reference titles, put those images in, put in some detail about the book, and ask an AI model to come up with an example cover brief. Now, in about a minute and a half, it will take 6 reference images and a brief, and it will produce a bit of text for you. Is that the best cover brief that's ever been written? No. Is it the best cover brief that's been written in 90 seconds? Maybe, because I think most of us would have struggled with it. And what that publisher is doing now is using that cover brief as the starting point for a conversation between the editor and the designer. What do they like in it? What do they dislike? What would they develop? Where would they just go in a completely different direction? And they found that that way of working has saved about half the time that's involved in the process. And they've quantified that. They're now going to reflect that expertise and build it into other things they do. Similarly, another publisher got the university press I mentioned earlier, got multiple reports from multiple parties, which had to be standardized before they could be put into their finance system. They used AI to help write a script to achieve that standardization. They spent time making sure that that script was accurate and proofreading it. But in the same way, very measurably, someone has an afternoon of their month back, and they're now spending that time on other activities. So I think that those are examples of the sort of project that I would start with. Build confidence in your own systems and people, build confidence in using the model, and I think that will pay dividends. I realize I've gone quite far past my allotted time. I'm about 5 minutes past where I thought I would be. I think we have a hard stop in about 10 minutes' time. So I'm going to finish quickly to allow time for questions. And I will encourage anyone who doesn't get a chance to get their question answered to get in touch with me offline. On this slide, you will see my email address. If you don't get your question answered, please feel free to reach out to me. You can no longer find me on X because I do not care to be part of that platform, but I'm on the slightly better alternative of Threads, and I'm all over LinkedIn. So please do ask a question if we do run out of time. Thank you for your patience, and I will now hand back to our event chairs to pick some questions from the chat. Thank you all very much indeed.
And thank you, George. We do have a number of questions, and we will, as George was saying, we will end the call at 3:05, so we still have about 10 minutes. The first question for you, regarding publishing use cases, if these involve uploading the manuscript, should we be concerned about copyright ownership and LLMs using that work as a learning text unauthorized?
Thank you for the question. It's a very good one, and I'm delighted to answer it. If you take the free public version of these tools, any of you can go to ChatGPT right now, for example, and not pay for it. There's an old saying in Silicon Valley: if you're not paying for something, you're not the customer, you're the product. So if you use the free version, whatever you put into it, it is learning from that. It's a process called reinforcement learning. AI takes what it is given and it learns. It learns not only from the manuscript that you put in, but it learns from the assessment you make of the response. It asks you for a thumbs up or a thumbs down. It will also infer how well it has done from your next response to it. And it will learn from all of that. If you are looking at pre-publication copyrighted material, something that's sensitive, your company's strategic plan, for example, please do not use the free public version of one of these tools. In general, if you are using a paid-for version, there is a data safeguard. So, for example, ChatGPT for Teams, by default, treats your data as private. It will not share it with anyone else. It will not learn from it. So as long as you trust them to keep to what they're promising, you can use that safely. And the barrier to entry for that product has come down quite sharply. Within my own business, which is now 4 people, we have 4 Teams licenses for about $50 a month. And I'm sure that we're getting the benefit from them. So it is at a level now that is accessible to even even to smaller organizations. So please use a paid for service if you're putting in anything sensitive. Also, please just do your own research. There is a privacy policy, there is a data retention policy on every AI company's website. If you do not see one there, that is a very significant flag to be careful. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. Also kind of frightening to think that whatever you put into a free version of ChatGPT is now becoming part of its training. Another question here is, what approach would you take to creating marketing materials for a title? In some cases, authors don't want anything related to their material used in AI tools. There's such a gray area when it comes to ideation, even if you have base prompts on similar titles versus the title in question.
Right. And this is a really complex issue. I know that there are many authors and literary agents who, from a good and principled standpoint, are asking for undertakings that nothing to do with their work touches an AI system. Again, I have every sympathy with that position. Does that mean we're no longer editing in Microsoft Word? Because there is a very sophisticated Copilot AI that's sitting behind Word. Does that mean we're no longer using Creative Suite to produce a book jacket or ancillary materials for marketing? Because again, there's a very sophisticated AI model sitting there. So I think there is a practical point here. And as publishers, it is incumbent on all of us to have an honest conversation with the people we work with about what we're using, about how we're using it, and how we would do this. Now, in my own mind, I think that the productivity benefits far outweigh the concerns in this area for myself. You may have your own judgment on that, and if so, I respect that. But as a really great example of this, the question was about, say, the creation of marketing assets. There's a gentleman called Keith Reigert, who is the CEO of Ulysses Press. If you Google Keith Reigert Ulysses, or in fact, I will attempt to multitask by putting his name into the chat as we talk. Keith has a very good blog talking about the use of AI within his own business. And he has recently shared an example of an AI-generated script where he can take a common set of starting points and generate all of the social media and Amazon assets that he needs for a particular book in a couple of minutes. Now, to my mind, I don't think that particularly threatens anything. I think it just makes him more productive and it gives his people more time. So I think that's a really good example of where this has a real benefit for marketers who, let us be honest, are very often quite overworked.
Thinking a little bit more about some of those ethical concerns, do you know which companies have been caught training their AI software on copyrighted material? Or do you think that all companies producing AI software are likely using copyrighted material for their training?
Okay, so I mean, look, the honest answer here is that pretty much everyone is being litigated against on some level, and that indicates, I think, the answer to that question. I will say that last summer, when the Atlantic magazine revealed that the Books 3 corpus had been used as training, and by the way, for anyone not familiar with that, Books 3 is a corpus of about 600,000 stolen ebooks taken from peer-to-peer networks. When that was revealed, several people, so Bloomberg and Meta, both apologized, withdrew Books 3 from their training data, and undertook not to use it again. OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, NVIDIA did not apologize, did not remove, and I believe continue to use it. I will also just make one exception to this, which is that for Adobe Firefly, which is Adobe's image generation tool, Adobe asserts that all of the images used to train that system were legitimately licensed and that they have made they've not used any unlicensed material. They are, I think, the only people I've seen make that categorical an assumption about that. What I would just say, I guess, in closing on this is that I am not necessarily suggesting bad faith or criminal conduct by those AI companies. There is certainly an assumption of fair use which they are relying on, and that is yet to be decided upon by a court. There is also the fact that in some cases there's a question about, is this malice or is it just an absence of curiosity and an absence of record keeping about what they've done? And I think those are open questions about how copyrighted material has been used. So this is, I'm afraid, a very grey area. I wish I could give you more certainties this afternoon.
I think we have time for just one more question. Thinking back to your before last slide, could you speak more about item 4, the principles for balanced and ethical use, thinking about higher risk use cases, especially for copyright diversity and translation? The concern here is questions of like who profits and like at whose expense is this happening?
Yeah, and I mean this is a really challenging one, right? Because the AI systems allow anyone to generate text. That text would be impossible to generate without the creative endeavors of millions of individual authors. And at the moment, those people are, in general, not benefiting across the board from that. Now, in terms of the licensing deals, some of the larger publishers, John Wiley, for example, have indicated that they will share proceeds with authors according to the terms of their contracts. But, I if I'm allowed to venture my own opinion here, I think we need to move quite quickly to a general collective licensing model. The fact is, this is not the first time that copyright has been challenged by technology. If you go back to my father's generation of sort of universities and teachers, the big concern was that the Xerox machine and photocopying was going to destroy the publishing industry. Lo and behold, there is a collective licensing model that compensates people still to this day for the use of photocopied material in universities. Does anyone do that anymore? Who knows? But I think that is the sort of model that we need to move to quite quickly. Similarly, we have collective licensing models for public libraries and other cases. And the International Publishers Association and national level trade associations have all talked this year about pushing for that kind of model. I understand there are conversations happening around that at Frankfurt Book Fair. If I were running one of the AI companies, it would just be a no-brainer to get into a collective model quite quickly and be on the front foot with it, because it doesn't cost a great deal of money in the scheme of things, but it means that there is a more equitable sharing of proceeds. So, okay, if I could wave a wand and have a magical wish, that would be, I think, my wish for this industry, that we could arrive at a collective solution quickly and internationally and collegially. But that may be far too much optimism for 3:05 on a Tuesday afternoon.
Oh, but I think that's a great spot to end off on. We still have a lot of questions, but we are unfortunately out of time. We can do our best to answer them in other ways, and I can send them to you, George, if you would like them. George, thank you.
I'd certainly love to see the questions, and to reiterate, I would, if anyone didn't get a chance to answer something within a sort of best endeavors of my own time, I will answer all of those as comprehensively as I'm able to.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we go, we'd love it if everyone could provide feedback on this session. We'll drop a link to the survey in the chat. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. We'll also be emailing you a link to a recording of this session as soon as it's available. To our attendees, we invite you to join our upcoming session, AI for Enhanced Discoverability and User Experience in Online Bookstores, scheduled for October 3. You can find information about all upcoming events and recordings of previous sessions on our website, bnctechforum.ca. Lastly, we'd like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through the Canada Book Fund, and thanks to you all for attending. Take care.